There are winters that freeze the world, and nights when the only thing standing between a man and the end is the silent gaze of a loyal dog. But what if that loyalty unleashed secrets darker than the blizzard outside, turning a hospital room into the scene of a deadly betrayal? When a little girl risked everything for a suffering German shepherd, none could imagine how far hope and danger would reach. What would you sacrifice for the one soul that never gave up on you? Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Snow fell in Duluth like a memory you couldn't shake. It didn't flutter or dance but pressed itself against the city, heavy and insistent, layering everything with silence. In early December, Lake Superior wore a crown of ice, the shoreline already surrendered to frost. Even the pine trees looked burdened, stooping under the relentless weight. The streetlights stretched long yellow columns across empty sidewalks, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break the hush. Officer Colin Mercer lived on the third floor of a red brick walk-up facing the water. The apartment was small and bare, a worn sofa, a battered kitchen table, a bookcase that leaned like an old friend after a long day. Most nights, the only sound was the wind scraping at the window and the distant hush of tires on snow-packed roads. Colin moved through these rooms the way you might move through a childhood home returned to after years away, quietly, as if not wanting to disturb ghosts. Mercer's uniform hung by the door, boots lined up with military precision. He'd come to Duluth a decade ago, chasing a job and a reason not to go home. Home had been fractured long before he ever left. A mother who'd moved on, a father he barely remembered, a scattering of half-siblings living new lives in other towns. Here in this lakeside city carved out of cold, Colin had managed to build something that resembled peace, if not happiness. For him, solace was a kind of ritual. Each evening, after a shift that blurred into the next, he'd hang his badge on the wall, shrug off the weight of stories that didn't belong to him, and sit by the window. Some nights he'd make tea, steam rising in thin spirals, fingers wrapped around the mug for warmth. But always, there was Atlas, the German shepherd who padded silently from room to room, shadowing Colin's movements, settling at his feet as dusk bled into night. Atlas had a way of folding himself into the apartment's corners, half guardian, half ghost, black and tan coat gleaming beneath the lamplight. He was older now, 7 winters in his bones, but his eyes were sharp and restless, as if waiting for orders that never came. Sometimes, Colin would trace the scar on Atlas's left hind leg, a jagged, pale mark left by broken glass during a rescue in California, before the dog's life had brought him here. They had both come to Duluth by way of loss. Atlas after the death of his first handler in a mudslide, Colin after running out of reasons to stay anywhere else. Most people in Duluth knew Officer Mercer only as the man who worked the night shift, kept to himself, and never missed a roll call. Fewer noticed the dog beside him, the way Atlas watched the world, with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Their bond was not loud or demonstrative, but woven into the small habits of survival. A shared glance, a breath released, the comfort of warmth in the endless cold. Sometimes, when the city seemed to creak beneath the weight of winter, Colin would walk Atlas down to the edge of the frozen lake. The ice stretched out under the moon, blue and cracked, vast as sorrow. Colin would pause, letting the leash go slack, and Atlas would stand sentry, muzzle lifted to catch the lake's wild scent. In those moments, everything else, the pain, the loneliness, the burdens he carried home from work, seemed to recede, leaving only the soft hush of fur against his palm and the distant bark of a lone fox in the woods. But peace in Duluth was always fragile, a quiet drawn too taut. There were nights when even the wind seemed to warn of storms gathering somewhere just beyond the city's edge, and sometimes it felt as if the whole world was waiting for a single sound to shatter the calm. That night, as Colin sat in the half-light, Atlas rose suddenly from his place by the sofa. The dog's ears pricked, body tense, his gaze fixed on the frosted window. For a heartbeat, time held its breath. Atlas growled low in his throat. Not the sound of alarm, but of recognition, as if some current of danger had found its way through the walls. Colin felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the weather. In the distance, sirens wailed faintly, blurred by snow. Atlas stood, muscles quivering, tail held stiff as a flag against the darkness. Colin looked out at the city, at the bare branches rattling in the wind, and wondered what it was that his dog sensed. What threat, what change, was already moving through the night. A shiver of unease passed between man and animal, an old language older than words. For a moment, the apartment felt too small to hold all the silence, all the histories pressing in. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the first promise of trouble, one that neither Colin nor Atlas would be able to outrun. Mini Cliffhanger 1. Atlas edged closer to the window, every muscle coiled, and let out a long, warning growl that echoed through the stillness. Somewhere out there, in the snow-blind dark, something had shifted, and neither man nor dog would sleep easy again. The air was brittle with cold when the call came in, a voice crackling through Colin's police radio, low and urgent, filtered through the static and snow. It was nearly midnight. The city of Duluth had folded itself into the hush of winter, the harbor lights a distant shimmer against the frozen blackness of Lake Superior. Even the streets seemed to shrink away from the wind, leaving behind only the tireless salt trucks and the hollow rattle of chains against ice. Colin was running patrol near the warehouses by the waterfront. Atlas curled in the passenger seat, nose pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the window. The car heater struggled to keep up, warmth pooling only around their knees. The world beyond the windshield was a maze of swirling flakes, headlights carving narrow tunnels through the dark. The dispatcher's words snapped Colin from his reverie. Unit 17, report of armed suspects. Warehouse C, Lake Avenue Dock. Possible shots fired. Something in the operator's tone, clipped and trembling, hinted at more than a routine break-in. In Duluth, you learned to hear what wasn't said. Colin's heart stuttered. He reached for the radio, murmured a response, and pressed his foot to the brake. Atlas straightened, a low vibration building in his chest, eyes alive with an energy that seemed to sharpen the air. Warehouse C stood at the very edge of the docks, its corrugated walls striped with frost, windows clouded and dull. The street lamps didn't quite reach the far end of the lot. Colin killed the headlights as he approached, the squad car rolling to a stop on a cushion of untouched snow. For a second, everything was so quiet. He could hear his own pulse and the faint, wet click of Atlas's tongue as the dog scented the air. Colin opened the door. The wind bit at his cheeks, laced with the faint tang of diesel and salt. Atlas leapt down beside him, every muscle wired for purpose. They moved together, a practiced routine, a silent language forged from years of trust and necessity. Colin's boots crunched softly as he crept along the warehouse's shadow, his breath slow and measured, left hand tight on the flashlight, right resting on his sidearm. Somewhere inside, something crashed, metal on concrete. The shriek of a box toppled in panic. Atlas's ears flicked. Colin pressed his back to the wall, forced himself to listen. There were voices, a flurry of Spanish and English, words blurred by adrenaline, threats tangled with fear. He edged toward the door, Atlas at his side, tail low and straight as a line of wire. Just as his hand touched the latch, a figure darted past one of the windows, the silhouette swollen and hunched, moving too fast for any clear shape. Then, a burst of gunfire, wild and sharp, ricocheting off steel beams. Colin ducked, adrenaline flaring in his veins. He pulled Atlas behind a stack of shipping crates, heart pounding so hard he could taste blood. Suddenly, the world exploded. There was no warning, just a flash of orange and white, the roar of a homemade device igniting. The force lifted Colin off his feet, slamming him hard into the frozen ground. He heard, somewhere in the chaos, the high, frantic yelp of Atlas. Shards of wood and glass rained down. For a moment, the only thing that existed was pain, raw and spreading, swallowing thought and sound. The night reassembled itself in fragments. The world swam in and out of focus. Above, a ring of blurred faces, red and blue lights painting everything in flickers. Colin tried to move, but agony anchored him. He gasped, tasting copper, hearing his own voice raw in his ears. His mind scrambled for Atlas. Where was he? But the world would not hold still. He saw a paramedic, her face too close, lips moving as she assessed the wound at his side. Blood blooming black against his uniform, heat leaking away into the snow. But then, past the surge of feet and frantic shouts, Colin caught sight of a shadow barreling through the police perimeter. Atlas, limping, battered, but wild with desperation. The dog barked once, lunging toward the stretcher. Gloved hands tried to hold him back, but Atlas wriggled free, pressed his muzzle to Colin's shaking hand, whined, a soft, keening plea that cut through the sirens and shouts. Colin tried to speak, his throat burning. The memory of his own childhood dog flashed in his mind. How, in another winter, a loyal animal had once watched over him through a night of fever. Now here was Atlas, refusing to let go. Even as paramedics loaded Colin onto the gurney, even as the blood soaked through the cotton, even as the world tilted dangerously toward oblivion. Atlas was forced away, hauled back by two officers, claws skittering over ice, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Colin's last glimpse as the ambulance doors slammed shut was of Atlas rearing up, howling into the night, a sound raw with grief and terror. Inside the ambulance, lights strobed, monitors screamed, hands pressed hard against Colin's wounds. The pain was blinding, but worse was the hollowing cold that seeped into his bones. The cold of loss, of knowing he might not see his companion again. Outside, the blizzard gathered, swallowing tire tracks, sirens fading into the whiteout. And in the shadows behind the warehouse, a figure watched, phone pressed to his ear. He's still alive. Move to phase 2, the man whispered, his words scattering like ash in the wind. The world was little more than pain and pulses of white light when Colin Mercer opened his eyes. The ceiling of St. Luke's ICU hovered above him, a dull field of tiles framed by halos of fluorescence. He drifted in and out, sometimes aware of masked faces moving with quiet urgency, sometimes slipping into memories that felt too sharp, too raw to belong to the present. There were machines everywhere. He could hear their beeping, their alarms, each one a reminder that time was passing, though he was not sure how much of it belonged to him. His body was a patchwork of numbness and agony, and every breath felt like swallowing shards of glass. The sounds of the city, the wind, distant sirens, even the gentle lapping of Lake Superior, had faded, replaced by the mechanical hush of a place where hope and fear warred in silence. He tried to move, but pain lanced through his side, anchoring him to the bed. For a while there was only the routine of medical care, blood drawn from veins, cold stethoscopes on bruised skin, the measured instructions of people whose voices he never saw. Sometimes he drifted out of himself entirely, floating in a sea of memory, Atlas's fur warm beneath his hand, the thud of paws on wooden floors, the cold stars burning over the lake. In those moments, the lines between pain and comfort blurred, but always, when he surfaced, the emptiness pressed in. It was Nurse Hannah Reeves who brought the world back into focus. She entered the room at dawn, the edge of her presence as gentle as snowfall. She was tall, her hair pulled back in a practical knot. Lines etched deep around her mouth and eyes, lines that spoke of griefs weathered and endured. She worked quietly, checking his IV, adjusting his blanket, noting the bruises and swelling with a practiced calm. But it was her silence that lingered. Something in the way she watched him, a depth of empathy that seemed to recognize more than just injury. Colin tried to speak, but his throat was sandpaper. Hannah brought a cup to his lips, her hands steady. He managed a few sips before the question, raw and desperate, clawed its way out. "Where's Atlas?" The words came out as a whisper, barely more than a breath. But the ache in them was unmistakable. Hannah looked at him for a long moment, her eyes glistening, and Colin saw, just for a second, the ghost of her own sorrow flicker behind the nurse's calm. She set the cup down, her hand resting lightly on his wrist. "He's safe, Officer Mercer," she said quietly. "They're keeping him at a facility outside town. He's being cared for." Her voice was gentle, but Colin heard what she wasn't saying. Hospital rules, infection risk, the boundaries that separated man and animal, even at the edge of life. He turned his head away, jaw tight, and blinked against the tears that threatened to spill. The room felt suddenly colder, emptier. Days slid by in a blur of procedures, tests, and fragile hours stitched together by exhaustion. Colin's wounds, deep and ugly, demanded constant attention. The surgical teams worked to repair the damage, their voices brisk and businesslike, as if determined to keep death at arm's length. Pain became a companion, a throb beneath every moment. But it was not the worst thing. The worst was absence, the missing weight at the end of his bed, the quiet gaze that always understood. Outside the ICU window, snow built up on the ledges, wind carving drifts into the corners of the hospital courtyard. Nights were long, the darkness settling like a shroud. Sometimes, in the stillest hours, Colin thought he could hear a faint scratching, his mind conjuring the sound of Atlas's claws on hardwood, a memory so vivid it hurt. Other times, a nurse would come in to check his vitals, and Colin would almost ask for Atlas again, but the words stuck heavy as stones. Nurse Hannah became his anchor. She didn't push, didn't fill the room with empty reassurances. Instead, she brought quiet, and in the quiet, Colin found small islands of peace. Sometimes, she'd adjust the blinds so he could see the distant shimmer of city lights, or tell him stories of growing up in the North Woods. stories that wound their way around loss, but always circled back to the stubborn beauty of survival. Colin learned, slowly, that Hannah had lost her only son in a car accident 10 years before. There were no photographs in her pockets, no tokens to keep memory alive. Just her hands, steady, capable, never trembling, and her willingness to sit beside him through the long hours, as if determined to hold space for someone else's grief. But as the days crawled on, a new fear grew inside Colin. He overheard staff whispering in the hallways about the investigation, about the attack, about how dangerous it might be if anyone learned where he was recovering. Rumors slid under the doors, carried by orderlies and clipped phone calls. And always, Atlas remained out of reach, separated by miles and rules that felt as cold and impenetrable as the snow outside. One night, after a particularly brutal round of pain, Colin found himself staring at the window, the wind screaming just beyond the glass. He pressed his hand against the cold, longing for the weight of a warm muzzle, for the silent reassurance that only Atlas could bring. A tear traced down his cheek, hot, humiliating, the kind of raw, childlike grief he hadn't let himself feel in years. He did not see Hannah standing in the doorway, watching, her own heart breaking in quiet empathy. For both of them, hope had become a scarce and precious thing, something to be rationed, savored, and never, ever spoken aloud. And far from the hospital, in a concrete pen beneath flickering fluorescent lights, Atlas lay curled in a tight, anxious circle. Each night, he would rise, pad to the door, and scratch softly, waiting for the return of a presence he could sense but not see. The two of them, man and dog, connected by 1,000 invisible threads, endured the darkness, each holding on in their own way to the slender, flickering hope that somewhere, somehow, the world might shift and bring them back to each other. The shelter on the outskirts of Duluth was a place built for transition, not for hope. Rows of steel kennels lined the walls, each one a holding cell for animals between worlds, some rescued, some abandoned, some waiting for a home they might never know. In the dim blue of early morning, the corridors were filled only with the muted shuffles of staff and the restless whimpers of creatures lost to confusion. Atlas was different from the others. He neither barked nor begged when people passed. He lay curled in the farthest corner of his pen, head on his paws, eyes flickering open at every movement, but never truly seeing the room around him. Every so often, a volunteer would attempt to coax him to eat, laying out bowls of kibble with a hopeful note in their voice. He would sniff, nose wrinkling, then turn away, hunger a distant ache compared to the storm within his chest. He had always understood separation, the changes of handlers, the uncertainty that trailed his days in California after the earthquake, the sharp, sudden grief when his first partner did not come back. But this absence was different. It gnawed at him with every passing hour. Scent and memory wove together, driving him to the kennel door, where he would sit, nose pressed to the gap, waiting for a familiar footstep, a voice, anything that would anchor him back to the world he knew. Nights were the worst. The shelter would quiet, lights dimmed, the city's noise held at bay by snow, and then, from the deepest reaches of his chest, Atlas would lift his head and howl, a long, low sound, heavy with the ache of missing. It was not loud nor fierce. Instead, it moved through the concrete and into the bones of anyone still lingering in the shelter, haunting, persistent, impossible to ignore. At first, staff tried to comfort him, bringing old blankets, sitting at his door with soft words and outstretched hands. But Atlas shied away from touch, as if any comfort not belonging to Colin was somehow a betrayal. Some volunteers, themselves no strangers to sorrow, would sit on the cold tile outside his kennel, reading quietly or humming lullabies into the gloom. Still, he waited. It was during one of those silent, snowbound afternoons that Ellie Saunders found him. She was a regular sight in the hospital corridors, a slip of a girl 9 years old, wrapped in scarves and knit caps, her skin pale from chemotherapy, but her eyes full of an ancient, stubborn light. She wandered where she shouldn't, ignoring the limits set by tired nurses. The shelter was her favorite place to disappear, where she could lose herself among the animals and the quiet. Ellie stood outside Atlas's pen, breath fogging the glass, her hands pressed flat to the cold. He looked up, tail barely twitching, ears half-cocked in polite indifference. But Ellie stayed, unafraid of the sighs or sorrow that radiated from him. She spoke in a whisper, stories of the hospital, her mother's worries, the dreams that wouldn't let her sleep. Each day she came back, kneeling on the hard floor, her fingers tracing circles on the metal as if drawing invisible doors. After a while, Atlas would rise, padding to the front, their eyes meeting in a conversation that needed no words. Ellie didn't expect him to perform tricks, didn't coax him to play. She understood waiting, understood a heart that refused to let go. Her presence became a constant, her voice a bridge between two kinds of loneliness. Word of Atlas and the girl spread through the hospital like warmth in winter. Nurses would peek into the shelter on their breaks, some leaving notes of encouragement, others simply pausing to watch the silent exchange between child and dog. More than one staff member was seen wiping tears away as they slipped out, unable to name the ache Atlas awakened in them. Ellie's visits began to soften something in Atlas. One afternoon, she pressed her palm to the glass, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Without thinking, he leaned forward, touching his nose to her small hand. Through the barrier, her fingers splayed, trembling, and for a moment, the walls of separation seemed thinner, a promise that neither would give up hope. As the days passed, debates flared among the hospital staff. Some argued for strict adherence to protocol. No animals in the ICU, no matter the story. Others, moved by the changes in both Ellie and Atlas, began to advocate for an exception. The chief nurse, her heart softened by the devotion she witnessed, drafted a petition. Even patients weighed in, some sending handwritten notes from their beds. Let the dog see his partner. Sometimes healing is more than medicine. At night, Atlas would still wait by the door, eyes locked on the hallway beyond. His coat lost its shine, and his body thinned, but he refused to surrender. Each howl seemed quieter now, but richer somehow. Heavy with longing, and stitched with a glimmer of something like faith. In the dark, as snow fell and Ellie dreamed in her hospital bed, Atlas dreamed too, a dream of a hand on his fur, a voice calling him home. The story of Atlas and Ellie moved through the hospital like a secret blessing, passing from room to room, whispered among staff and patients alike. It was not hope, not yet, but it was something close. A reminder that even in the deepest winter, hearts could still thaw, and that even the loneliest among us might find a way to reach each other, if only we don't give up. Winter deepened over Duluth, drawing long, blue shadows across the city, painting the windows of St. Luke's Hospital with frost so thick It blurred the outside world to the palest gray. Inside the hospital, routine moved like clockwork. Rounds, medication charts, machines humming along. But for those who watched closely, there were subtle changes. Restless glances between doctors in the hall, quiet conversations behind closed doors, the faintest undercurrent of tension vibrating beneath the day-to-day rhythm. Colin Mercer's recovery was a slow war, each small victory paid for in pain and exhaustion. He was stronger now, able to shift in bed, to speak in full sentences, to track the faces that drifted in and out of his room. But there were nights when he woke breathless, every muscle locked, haunted by flashes of fire and chaos, Atlas's desperate howl echoing in his chest. He tried not to ask about his partner, the question burning behind his teeth, afraid that hope would make the longing worse. One morning, while dawn still struggled to break through the clouds, a new presence arrived outside Colin's door. Agent Marcus Shaw, FBI, 48, a face as hard as Riverstone, flashed a badge at the nurse's desk and entered with a gait that said he'd seen too much of the world to ever be caught off guard. He introduced himself to Colin in a low, steady voice, eyes missing nothing. Shaw was not the type to comfort. He stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed on the traffic snaking along the snowy streets below. He explained in sparse, measured words that the attack at the warehouse wasn't random, a calculated strike against law enforcement by a network moving drugs up from Chicago, through the ports of Duluth, onto the Canadian border. There had been other attacks, other officers hurt or silenced, but none had survived long enough to remember the faces behind the explosions. Colin listened, feeling the weight of every word, his own vulnerability exposed. He wondered, quietly, with a kind of bone-deep dread, if the hospital was as safe as everyone claimed. Shaw seemed to sense this, leaning in closer, lowering his voice. "You're not out of danger," he said, not unkindly. "We think there's an inside connection, someone with access, someone who knows more than they should." Even as Shaw spoke, a different current ran through the hospital. Dr. Gabriel Norris, the hospital's chief trauma surgeon, moved with his usual authority. White coat crisp, shoes polished, smile practiced. But beneath the surface, Norris's nerves ran raw. His cell phone buzzed in his pocket more often now, and he disappeared for long stretches between surgeries, murmuring into the phone in Spanish, voice clipped and urgent. Few knew that Norris was not just a healer, but a man compromised by desperation and debt. Years ago, a series of reckless investments had left him exposed, his future mortgaged to men who demanded more than repayment. The drug syndicate had offered him a deal, money in exchange for information, silence and, if needed, a willingness to tip the balance of life and death in the operating room. One night, as the city braced for another storm, Norris slipped into a supply closet near the ICU. He dialed a secure number, speaking in hushed Spanish. "The cop survived. I can still fix this, but it has to be soon. There's a girl here, a patient. She saw too much, heard things she shouldn't have. And that dog, it's causing problems." What Norris did not know was that Ellie Saunders, restless from pain and boredom, had wandered down the corridor, drawn by the sound of voices behind the door. She pressed her ear to the wood, catching fragments of the conversation. "Liquid. Final dose. No witnesses." The words stung her, leaving her breathless. She recognized the voice. The man with the perfect smile who had patted her on the head after her last treatment. Ellie hurried back to her room, heart racing, mind churning with questions she didn't dare ask aloud. Should she tell Nurse Hannah? Would anyone believe a sick child who saw danger where adults saw only kindness? For the first time since she had begun her treatments, fear settled over her, thick and paralyzing, as cold as the lake wind at night. Meanwhile, Agent Shaw met privately with Nurse Hannah Reeves. He trusted her instincts, respected her quiet vigilance. They discussed the possibility of moving Colin to a safer location. But Hannah argued fiercely that the trauma of displacement might undo all the progress he'd made. They needed eyes on the inside, someone to watch, someone who understood how easily darkness could hide in plain sight. Mini Cliffhanger 3. That evening, as the snow began to fall, Ellie lay awake, feverish, replaying the words she'd overheard. In her pocket, she clutched a note she'd written in shaky pencil. "The doctor is not who he says he is. Please be careful." The night outside pressed closer, filled with secrets. In the shelter, Atlas paced his pen, his instincts bristling, as if he could sense the danger creeping closer to everyone he loved. And in a hospital supply closet, Dr. Norris poured a vial of clear liquid into a syringe, his hands steady, his face set. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "Tomorrow, I finish this." Night unspooled slowly across Duluth, painting the city in a hush so deep it seemed to press in from all sides. At St. Luke's, nurses moved through corridors with practiced grace. The world narrowed to the pulse of machines and the steady drip of saline. Yet something had changed in the air. An expectancy, brittle and strange, as if the hospital itself knew that soon everything would tilt. The petition to reunite Atlas with his partner had grown too large to ignore. Nurses, orderlies, and even a handful of doctors whispered encouragement in the break room. Stories of the German shepherd's devotion passing from hand to hand like a blessing. For every voice of protocol, another rose for mercy. The hospital's chief nurse finally relented, her signature wobbly but resolute at the bottom of the order. For patient well-being, exception granted. She tried to sound official, but her eyes glistened with something close to hope. Early the next morning, a hospital van rumbled through drifting snow, carrying Atlas from the shelter to St. Luke's. The moment the crate door swung open, Atlas surged out, not with fear, but with the single-minded purpose of one who knows his person is in need. He moved down the corridor, nose twitching, catching Colin's scent, tail lifted in tense anticipation. His paws clicked over tile, and the world narrowed to a point just ahead. The ICU, room 407. When Nurse Hannah met Atlas in the lobby, something in her chest caught and held. He was thinner, his eyes bright but hollowed by longing. She knelt, letting him press his nose to her palm, and whispered a promise. "He's waiting for you, Atlas. Go." Inside the ICU, time slowed. Colin lay half-propped on pillows, a fresh wave of disbelief and yearning crashing over him as the door opened and Atlas appeared. Hesitant at first, then bounding forward, a breathless reunion played out in silent touches. The dog's muzzle found Colin's hand. His body, once coiled in anxiety, melted into the space at the foot of the bed. For a moment, the world contracted to that island of peace, the lines between hope and despair blurring in the gentle weight of fur beneath trembling fingers. Nurses paused outside the glass, some turning away to hide tears. The reunion was wordless, but it radiated into the hospital, chasing away a little of the cold that had settled over every heart. but tranquility was a fragile thing. Dr. Gabriel Norris entered the ICU, chart in hand, face composed in his usual impassive calm. He greeted Colin in soft, measured tones, checked monitors, adjusted an IV. Atlas, moments before relaxed, bristled in an instant. Ears pricked, tail rigid, his eyes tracking the doctor's every move. A low, unbroken growl rose from his throat, subtle at first, then sharper as Norris approached the bedside. The tension in the room thickened. Colin's fingers tightened in Atlas's fur. He had never seen his dog react like this, not even in the chaos of disaster scenes or the confusion of new handlers. The growl was not fear. It was warning. Norris tried to laugh it off, offered a few polite words about anxious animals in medical settings. But his voice skittered on the air, brittle and forced. His hands, normally steady, shook just enough to betray him. Hannah watched from the doorway, something old and instinctive prickling at the back of her mind. She remembered Atlas in the shelter, how he had shied away from strangers, but always melted to comfort around Colin, or Ellie, or staff he trusted. This was different. This was not anxiety, but vigilance. And there was something in Dr. Norris's eyes, a flicker gone too quickly to name, that set her on edge. That evening, as sunset bled gold over the lake, Colin struggled to make sense of the day's events. Every time Norris came near, Atlas transformed from companion to sentinel, blocking the doctor's approach with his body, growl deepening to a rumble. Other staff took notice. Some joked nervously, others quietly avoided the room when Norris was scheduled. Colin pressed his lips to Atlas's ear, voice low and hoarse. "What do you know that I don't?" Atlas's body vibrated with tension. But when Colin touched his face, the dog's eyes softened. It was a warning, yes, but also a plea to trust what could not be explained. As night fell, Nurse Hannah sat with Ellie in the pediatric wing. The girl's face was pale, eyes wide with worry. She handed Hannah the note she'd written the night before, the pencil marks pressed deep into the paper. "The doctor. He's not who he says he is." Hannah's hand trembled as she read, the puzzle pieces beginning to fall into place. She had seen too much to ignore the warning signs. A dog's intuition, a child's fear, a pattern of nervous glances and closed doors. Meanwhile, Atlas kept his silent vigil at Colin's side, muscles taut, ears trained on the corridor. In the hush between monitors and distant footsteps, he seemed to sense the storm about to break, danger moving closer, the kind only a loyal heart could feel. Mini Cliffhanger 4. That night, as the hospital slept and snow fell in thick, muffling sheets, Atlas rose from his spot, stalked to the door, and pressed his body against it, refusing to budge. In the darkness, just beyond the glass, Dr. Norris paused, syringe glinting in his hand, the air electric with threat and the promise of reckoning. Snow drifted in lazy spirals outside the hospital windows, blanketing the city in a silence that felt heavier than ever. Inside, though, a different kind of storm was gathering, one of suspicion, urgency, and dread that seemed to seep into the bones of everyone closest to Colin's room. Agent Marcus Shaw had always trusted patterns, money trails, phone logs, and those quiet details most people never noticed. He sat in a windowless office deep inside St. Luke's, the glow from his laptop painting his face in shifting blues and grays. Files spread before him, financial records, hospital inventory reports, encrypted emails all pointing toward one undeniable truth. Dr. Gabriel Norris was not only compromised, but entangled in something larger than greed. wire transfers from shell companies in Chicago, medical shipments that never arrived, yet were billed to the hospital's account. A secret, encrypted message from a known cartel fixer flagged by the Bureau weeks ago. The lines connected, tighter and tighter, pulling Norris's mask away to reveal a man for whom healing had become a transaction, loyalty a currency. Shaw's pulse raced as he scanned the last of the evidence. There wasn't enough to make a public arrest. Not yet. The real proof, he feared, was still inside the hospital's walls. He needed eyes on the ground, someone trusted. He found that trust in Nurse Hannah Reeves. She'd watched the hospital's ebb and flow for years, knew which glances were loaded, which silences meant trouble. When Shaw approached her in the break room, urgency sparking between their words, she didn't flinch. "We need to keep Colin safe," she murmured, glancing over her shoulder at a pair of orderlies. "And I need to know what Dr. Norris is really doing after hours." Hannah, ever methodical, began watching Norris's routines with a nurse's eye for detail. Who he visited, how long he lingered, the way his hands twitched when Atlas bared his teeth. She noticed new faces in the corridors, a supply tech with the wrong badge, a pharmaceutical rep who seemed to wander into ICU without reason. When she found Ellie's note, "The doctor is not who he says he is," she felt ice settle in her veins. The girl rarely spoke out of turn, and her intuition had already proven itself in quiet, startling ways. Hannah decided she would not let another child's warning be ignored. Meanwhile, in the pediatric wing, Ellie fought her own battle. She was running a low fever, her body battered by treatments, but her mind was sharp. She watched Dr. Norris glide past her door, saw the tightness at the corners of his mouth. She remembered every word she'd overheard, the way his voice dropped when he spoke Spanish, the threat hidden in his silences. Still, fear kept her quiet. Would anyone believe her? Would it make a difference? She drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, the weight of the secret pressing on her chest. Elsewhere in the hospital, Atlas never strayed from Colin's side. Even as the world faded to the soft beep of monitors and the relentless tick of the wall clock, he remained vigilant. Head up, body tensed, hackles prickling at every unfamiliar sound. When Dr. Norris entered the room, Atlas growled, the noise a warning deep and electric, making the air vibrate. Late that night, as a blizzard raged outside, Dr. Norris slipped into a storage closet. He moved with the precision of someone who'd practiced this routine, hands steady as he uncapped a vial and drew a clear liquid into a syringe. His phone buzzed once. A message. "Tonight. Finish it." He stuffed it into his pocket and disappeared into the shadowed corridor. At the same time, Ellie, restless and sweating, forced herself to leave bed. Driven by instinct, she wandered the hallway, trailing her IV pole, and stopped outside the supply room just as Norris exited, syringe hidden in his coat. He almost collided with her, freezing for a heartbeat before regaining his mask. "You should be asleep," he said, voice slick with forced warmth. Ellie nodded, gaze dropping, heart pounding, and watched him glide away. Back in ICU, Atlas grew increasingly agitated. He paced the room, returning again and again to the door, nails clicking in a rapid, frantic rhythm. Colin, sapped by pain and medication, watched through a haze, dread mounting as Atlas refused to settle. Mini cliffhanger 4. Ellie's fever spiked that night, forcing her back to her bed, shivering, unable to speak to Hannah before collapsing into a fitful sleep. In ICU, Atlas began to bark, a sharp, insistent alarm, drawing nurses and staff. But Norris, already masked and gloved, entered with the syringe, eyes cold, every movement rehearsed. The stage was set. No one knew if help would arrive in time. In that terrible hush between midnight and dawn, every hope hung by a single, fraying thread. A blizzard battered Duluth that night, snow streaming sideways across shuttered windows, drowning out the city's usual sounds. In the hospital's labyrinthine corridors, the storm felt like an omen, a pale, relentless force pressing everyone inward, stirring old fears, new desperation. But inside ICU room 407, a different storm was about to break. Dr. Gabriel Norris moved with a calm born of countless rehearsals. Every step, every gesture had been practiced in the mirrored stillness of his bathroom at home. Hands gloved and steady, face arranged in professional detachment. He entered the room quietly, mask tight, clipboard balanced on his forearm. The syringe lay hidden in his coat pocket, a fragile, lethal secret. Colin Mercer dozed fitfully, half lost in the narcotic fog of painkillers, the IV's rhythmic pulse barely keeping the ache at bay. Atlas, restless, pressed his body against the hospital bed, muscles trembling. Something in the dog's ancient blood, older than training or memory, screamed danger. Nurse Hannah, checking monitors 2 doors down, caught a flash of Norris's coat vanishing into Colin's room. The unease she'd carried all day suddenly bloomed into panic. She abandoned her cart, heart stuttering, hurrying down the corridor, the storm's wind rattling the windows as if warning her to move faster. Inside the room, Norris moved to Colin's bedside. The monitors hissed softly, casting a green glow over the man and the dog. Norris withdrew the syringe, holding it low. The plan was simple. 1 injection, the medical chart already prepared for complications. The cartel's payment would clear his debts, and the world would move on, none the wiser. But Atlas saw him. The German shepherd rose, blocking Norris's path, hackles raised, a guttural snarl rising in his throat. The dog's eyes never left the doctor's hand, the glint of the syringe a spark in the gloom. Norris hesitated, just for a heartbeat, then lunged, his patience finally splintering. Atlas exploded into motion, all coiled muscle and fury. He launched himself between Norris and the bed, jaws snapping around the doctor's wrist just as the needle came within inches of Colin's IV. The impact sent the syringe clattering to the floor, its deadly contents splattering harmlessly onto the linoleum. The room erupted into chaos. Colin jerked awake, confusion morphing into horror as he saw Norris struggle, Atlas's teeth locked in a grip that was both warning and retribution. Norris tried to wrench free, his other hand scrabbling for the fallen syringe, but Atlas held fast, his body a barrier no human could breach. Down the corridor, Hannah heard the commotion, racing toward the sound as Atlas's bark, sharp, guttural, filled with urgency, echoed down the hallway. Staff converged, drawn by the alarm, and Agent Shaw, alerted by a frantic text from Hannah, was already sprinting through the maze of hospital wings, weapon holstered, but his resolve hard as stone. In the confusion, Ellie, awakened by the noise and her own fever dreams, sat up in her hospital bed, dread and hope warring in her chest. She knew, with the certainty only children and animals possess, that this was the moment everything would either shatter or be saved. Security burst into the ICU, Hannah and Shaw at the front. Norris, arm bloodied where Atlas had bitten, froze, eyes wild, all composure lost. In that instant, the mask slipped away. There was no healer here, only a desperate, broken man trapped by his own choices. Shaw pinned Norris, cuffing him with hands that shook not from fear, but the adrenaline of a crisis averted. Nurses swept in, retrieving the shattered syringe. The liquid inside was quickly tested. Not medication, but a rare toxin, lethal in drops, smuggled in from Mexico and traced to a series of mysterious deaths across 3 states. Atlas, chest heaving, stood over Colin until the danger was gone. The connection between man and dog, 1,000 invisible threads, had saved a life, and perhaps countless others. Colin, weak but conscious, reached for his partner. Atlas leaned in, eyes softening, and let out a long, shuddering sigh, as if finally releasing all the fear and tension held tight for days. Through the glass, hospital staff and patients alike gathered, witnessing the aftermath, a room thick with relief, sorrow, awe. Ellie wept quietly in her bed, joy and exhaustion mingling. Hannah put a trembling hand on Atlas's back, whispering, "Good boy, you saved him." In that fragile, snow-wrapped dawn, the truth unwound. Norris's arrest triggered a chain reaction. His phone, seized and searched, led authorities to encrypted chats, cartel names, and payment routes for counterfeit drugs. The toxin meant for Colin was traced to a stockpile in the hospital's own pharmacy, linking the hospital to a sprawling criminal network. Agent Shaw's evidence, combined with eyewitness testimony and hospital security footage, cracked the case wide open. But in room 407, as the storm outside softened and the city of Duluth exhaled, all that mattered was this: one man's life saved by the unbreakable loyalty of his dog. In the quiet that followed, Colin wept, not for pain, but for gratitude, for the miracle that arrived not as a flash of light, but as the steady, steadfast heart of a companion who refused to let go. The air shifted, the worst had passed, but the ripples of that night would reach far beyond these hospital walls. The storm finally broke over Duluth, the city waking to a dawn pale with the promise of something new. Snowdrifts softened the scars of the night before, smoothing the world to quiet edges. For the first time in weeks, the sun pushed through the clouds, glinting off rooftops and throwing long gold bars across the frozen harbor. Inside St. Luke's Hospital, a hush lingered, exhaustion mixed with relief, grief braided with a sense of rescue. Word of what had happened in room 407 moved through the halls not as gossip, but as a shared story, whispered with reverence, a note of awe running beneath every retelling. Colin Mercer was alive, bruised and battered, stitched and sore. He found himself afloat in a sea of gratitude. The physical wounds would heal, the bruises, the broken rib, the bruised lung, but it was the invisible healing that took him by surprise. Atlas, never more than a pace away, seemed to sense every ripple of pain or fear, the dog's steadfast gaze pulling Colin back from the edge when memories threatened to drag him under. In moments of panic, when the world closed in and the clatter of a cart in the hallway sounded like an explosion, Atlas would simply rest his heavy head on Colin's thigh, breathing slow and steady until they both remembered how to stay. Nurse Hannah Reeves visited often, her presence like a lantern in the dim. Sometimes she brought tea, sometimes just silence. Always the quiet confidence of someone who had outlived her own grief and knew that healing was both possible and never complete. She never spoke of the night Norris was taken away, nor did she dwell on the near miss. Instead, she sat beside Colin as he worked through painful stretches, listening when he needed to talk, waiting in companionable quiet when he didn't. Ellie Saunders recovered too. The fever that had ravaged her tiny body broke soon after the ordeal. In the days that followed, she visited Colin and Atlas in his room, trailing her IV stand like a badge of stubbornness. She brought homemade cards, crayon scrawls of dogs and sunshine, notes of "Thank you, Atlas," and read to the pair from her favorite stories. The three formed an unlikely fellowship, bound by the trauma that had passed through their lives and the courage that had held it at bay. The hospital, so long a place of boundaries and rules, changed in the aftermath. The story of Atlas's heroism became more than legend. It became an emblem of hope. In the staff lounge, a photograph was pinned to the bulletin board. Atlas, still and noble, seated at Colin's side, both looking out through the window at a world remade by morning light. Underneath it, someone had written, "Sometimes the best medicine has 4 legs and a loyal heart." Justice moved swiftly. Dr. Gabriel Norris, handcuffed and stripped of the authority he had once wielded, confessed to his crimes under the weight of evidence, guilt cracking open beneath relentless questioning. The wider investigation that followed unearthed not only his dealings, but a trail of illicit drugs, falsified records, and more than one medical professional caught in the web. The news spread beyond Duluth, drawing headlines and outrage. A city, then a region, shocked by how close evil had come, and how quietly it had almost succeeded. But here, in the hospital, the story was not one of crime and punishment, but of grace. At a small ceremony in Duluth's city square, just as the last of the storm's snow melted into spring, Atlas was awarded the Service Hero Medal, a bright band of blue and gold draped around his thick neck. The mayor read a citation for bravery, but it was Ellie who brought the crowd to tears. In a voice high but unwavering, she said, "Sometimes what saves us isn't a miracle. It's a friend who stays beside us when we're most afraid." As applause rang out and Atlas barked softly, embarrassed perhaps by all the attention, Colin knelt beside him, one arm slung over the dog's broad shoulders, tears sparkling on his lashes. Hannah stood behind them, her face wet, and Ellie wrapped her small hands around Atlas's paw, her smile brighter than the spring sun. Time moved on, as it always does. The wounds closed, but the scars remained, not marks of pain, but of survival, reminders of all that had been risked and all that had been saved. For Colin, every day was different now. He rose with the sun, walked slowly by the lake, Atlas matching him step for step. Sometimes the silence was heavy, carrying the ghosts of nights filled with sirens and snow, but it was never empty. Atlas was there, a living promise that loyalty endures, that love is stubborn, and that even the most broken things can be made whole. In the hospital lobby, under the soft hum of lights, Hannah started a journal, notes on small miracles, on grief and joy, on what it means to watch someone come back to life. In her pages, she wrote, "We are all healed, in the end, not by the hands of medicine, but by the hearts willing to wait out the winter with us." The people of Duluth remembered. They remembered the winter the city nearly lost one of its own, and the German shepherd who taught them all to believe, once more, in quiet acts of courage. The seasons turned in Duluth. Snow gave way to thaw, the river cracking open under a pale blue sky, ice breaking with a sound like distant applause. Streets bloomed with salt-worn grass and stubborn wildflowers. Life in the lakeside city returned to its familiar rhythm. But for those who'd lived through that haunted winter, nothing was quite the same. Colin Mercer stood at the water's edge, the wind from Lake Superior tugging at his jacket, the sunlight glinting off Atlas's fur as the German shepherd bounded after a thrown stick. There was a stillness in Colin now, a kind of inner hush where once had been only restless searching. The city was no longer just a place to disappear. It was home, a place he had been chosen to return to, remade by pain, gratitude, and a story that kept asking to be retold. After his release from St. Luke's, Colin made a decision as profound as any he'd made in uniform. He handed in his badge, the old shield heavy in his palm. Policing had taught him strength, endurance, vigilance, but it was Atlas who had reminded him of what could be found in vulnerability, in simply staying. The notion of purpose changed shape. Service was not always a matter of running toward gunfire or danger. Sometimes it meant walking beside another soul through the long shadow of loss. With his pension and a little money raised by the hospital community, Colin launched Northern Light Companions, a non-profit unlike any Duluth had seen. Its mission was simple and extraordinary: to unite retired working dogs, search and rescue, service, police, with people who needed them most. Seniors in lonely homes, children in long-term care, veterans healing from memories that refused to fade. The organization grew quietly at first, fueled by word of mouth and stories that spread further than any advertisement could reach. Atlas became the heart and face of the mission. His image, captured by a local photographer, head high, eyes calm, a wisp of winter still on his muzzle, was printed on flyers, featured in news articles, and shared across the country. But he was never just a mascot. He attended every visit, every intake, every gentle session where a hand first reached for fur and hope flickered in tired eyes. Ellie Saunders, her cancer now in remission, became the youngest volunteer. She arrived at every meeting with a backpack full of coloring books and stories, always seeking out the quietest child in the room, the one who stared most at the floor. It was Ellie who could coax a laugh from the hardest places, who told everyone that dogs like Atlas listen better than doctors and don't ever interrupt. Her friendship with Atlas deepened, a bond between survivor and guardian, between the bright possibility of youth and the calm loyalty of age. Nurse Hannah Reeves, too, found her life changed. Retirement had been on the horizon, but she postponed it, pouring herself into the work of the new nonprofit, mentoring young nurses and writing a memoir, A Winter's Light, that quietly became a bestseller among those hungry for stories of healing and connection. In her pages, she described not the horror of what had almost happened, but the quiet heroics that held the world together, the patient endurance of pain, the grace of silent companionship, the fierce hope that waits through the longest night. Justice, too, carried on its slow work. The unraveling of Dr. Norris's network led to the closure of illegal supply routes, new checks and balances in the city's hospitals, and more than any single prosecution, the restoration of trust that had nearly been broken. The story of what happened at St. Luke's was told at police conferences, in medical ethics courses, and in the quiet living rooms of families who now believed again in second chances. The city honored Atlas once more, this time at a community festival by the lake. Children tossed him treats, parents snapped photos. Colin accepted hugs and thanks from neighbors who had never spoken to him before. A city councilwoman declared, "Sometimes the truest hero is the one who never sought applause." Atlas, unfazed, rolled in the grass and licked the ice cream from Ellie's fingers, just a dog again in a crowd of old friends. As dusk fell and the harbor reflected gold and lavender across the sky, Colin stood with Atlas at his side, watching the lights blink on along the shoreline. He remembered those endless, harrowing nights in the hospital. The dread, the pain, the moment when everything he loved seemed poised to vanish. He remembered, too, the surge of hope, the dogged faith that even in the blackest winter, something could endure. He spoke softly, voice carrying on the wind. "You saved me, buddy. You gave me back more than life. You gave me a reason to keep believing." Atlas pressed close, eyes shining with contentment, and the world felt, for a heartbeat, utterly whole. Sometimes, what keeps us alive is not a miracle, but the steady loyalty at our feet. Sometimes the difference between despair and hope is the quiet touch of a companion who refuses to leave us behind. So tell me, where were you the last time you believed in miracles? What story of quiet courage or loyal companionship changed your life? Share your memory below. Maybe together we can be the light for someone still waiting for hope to arrive.